Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Thursday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with the National Weather Service. It is the 5th of December and quite a mess in south central Alaska this evening. Hopefully not too bad where you are watching from. As always, we encourage you to visit our website at www.arh.noaa.gov. That gets you to the entire statewide view of what's going on in your community with the watches, warnings, and advisories put up there, as well as all of the marine zones lit up with small craft warnings to perhaps storm warnings if you're south of the Aleutians at this point. Give us a call on the weather info line, 800-472-0391. Find each Weather Service office in Alaska on Twitter, NWS Fairbanks, NWS Anchorage, or NWS Juneau. On Facebook, we're found at U.S. National Weather Service Alaska, and on YouTube at NWS Anchorage, where you can get a shorter version of what's going on with the entire 4 sets of weather charts for Alaska that'll take you through the next 2 days or so, starting with today, tonight, and then on into tomorrow and the next day. Then later, after this show is finished, go over to Alaska Public on YouTube, or just search for AKWX TV, short for Alaska Weather TV, and you'll get the entire broadcast of what we're doing here right now, about 15, maybe 30 minutes after the show. So a lot of different ways to get the same information before and after the show, and we invite you to check those out anytime. Hazardous weather right now across our state. Nothing going on for southeast. Things are fairly quiet for you right now. It is cold, but it is dry, and it is a relatively calm period for you. In south central, the National Weather Service office in Anchorage has extended the freezing rain advisory until about midnight now. We were previously looking at that and thinking about 6 o'clock. Things have gotten a lot better as far as what's falling out of the sky, but the roads are still pretty bad. And there's still some patchy and light areas of freezing precipitation falling. So it's not quite done yet, but the worst has certainly passed through. So hopefully conditions will be improving as we get into the next day or so, but they're still pretty slick out there, and there is still additional light rain falling that is freezing on contact. So conditions are not improving, but the weather conditions are improving out there, if that makes sense there. Let's take a look at the interior, though. Conditions are worsening in many parts of the interior. Winter storm watches here shaded in kind of this in-between orange, all the way from the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range all the way into the Yukon Flats and into the middle Tanana Valley. That does include Fairbanks, but at press time, when we were putting this together here in production time, this was a winter storm watch. It is now a freezing rain advisory. We're expecting about, I believe, a 1/10 of an inch or so of freezing rain in the valley there. So prepare for that. A winter storm warning for areas around Eagle and Northway, and also to the west. A lot of these will be expiring tonight, though, so conditions should be improving tomorrow, but freezing rain has been an issue there across some parts of the lower and middle Yukon Valley, all the way from Beddoes to Tanana out toward Galena, Ambler, and the south and west facing slopes of the Brooks Range there. Across the Arctic coast and the Chukchi Sea coast, looks like advisories will continue there. Another 2 inches of snow possible as we head into tonight and into tomorrow. Some of that going into Saturday as well. You'll notice advisories there around the Kotzebue Sound region and also along the Yukon Valley there as you get a little bit closer to the YK Delta itself. For southwest Alaska and the Aleutians, things are quiet for now. However, south of the Aleutians for tomorrow, storm warnings starting up there. So we'll cover that as we get into the marine forecast in just a little bit. A lot going on. Once again, if you need some more information about what's going on in your village, the best way to do that is by NOAA Weather Radio or going to our website at weather.gov. Click on Alaska, and that'll take you to your community, or head to our state website at arh.noaa.gov. Here's a look at the satellite picture across the Bering Sea, and a couple things to point out here. A lot of slugs of moisture, a lot of these moving northward. And once again, the big problem with our overall weather picture in the state today is a very strong area of high pressure, just locked in that cold air, entrenched across the nooks and crannies of Alaska, especially the interior right now, and previously today over south central Alaska. Some of that is eroding over south central Alaska, but not so much for the interior. It's the same weather pattern that is bringing the very intense cold to the lower 48, as a lot of your friends and neighbors down in the 48 are probably starting to complain about already. Out across the Bering Sea, though, you can see the moisture going up and over what's still sitting across the mainland of Alaska. And as that's happening, we're getting that mixed precipitation across the west. In some places, we're seeing rain. A little bit farther into the interior, much more likely there's some freezing rain there. And we've seen a number of circulations out across the west that'll likely latch into some more moisture across the North Pacific. So this isn't a situation that's just going to suddenly quit. It's really going to focus on the west coast, at least for the next 2 days, with periods of rain and perhaps some snow across the north and west. You can see that southerly pattern really taking shape here in this view across most of Alaska. Southeast right now, pretty dry and pretty clear, but certainly cold again. And here's that southerly push working up and over the interior, coming over the Alaska Range. And look at the brighter white clouds here, really showing a lot more lift across the Yukon Valley and across the Brooks Range, all wrapping into pretty healthy area of low pressure in the upper atmosphere. Looks like the ridge of high pressure that's keeping this pattern going is still pretty much locked in place across the region. It's that upside down U-shaped pattern, sometimes called an omega block, that you'll see here in the jet stream pattern here in just a few minutes. Pretty familiar shape. We had that over the summer, and it was one of the same patterns that kept us pretty dry and pretty mild, and bringing a lot of wet weather to the west, and in some cases keeping the interior pretty dry. Well, in this case, it's bringing that warm and wet air aloft, and then running that right over that very cold and dry pattern across the interior right now, with high pressure parked out across the western Yukon. So interesting things taking shape out there, and freezing rain again continuing in many parts of the state at this hour. Earlier today, some of that was pretty heavy, working its way up from south central into the interior, and then eventually over the Brooks Range, or over the Alaska Range and into the interior, where we saw some snow up around Bettles and Ambler. Areas of blowing snow across the Arctic coast, pockets of rain across the Seward Peninsula, and looked like rain across parts of the eastern Aleutians there, with stronger winds shaping up here across the west as the next trough works its way west-east. A stationary boundary across southeastern Alaska will remain pretty much in place tonight. That's allowing the winds to shift around a little bit for the inner channel, so it should allow the winds to diminish as we get into the next couple days there. Cold high pressure, though, not too far off from southeast, really keeping the chill on for parts of the Panhandle. Looking for rain across Kodiak Island and parts of the Bristol Bay, out across the YK Delta and the Seward Peninsula tonight, and all the way up into Kotzebue Sound. Well, with that warm and wet air moving over that ridge of high pressure, we're going to get freezing rain to continue across the middle Yukon Valley, and some pockets of snow across the Brooks Range and perhaps north of Prince William Sound. But as we get into Friday, it looks like most of what we'll see will just be very intermittent periods of light rain, perhaps some patchy freezing rain across south central. A lot of that really diminishing though as we get into Friday, and then pockets of snow and freezing rain for the interior. Looks like the frontal boundary will linger right across the Arctic coast, but mainly north of the Brooks Range. That'll keep it as snow across the Arctic coast itself. Watch for some blowing and drifting snow in some cases there, especially as you get closer to the triple point out across the Chukchi Sea. That broad southeasterly flow coming across the Alaskan Peninsula, that'll keep that as rain for you in the YK Delta into Norton Sound. On the other side of the boundary, though, it is cold enough to see rain mixed with snow. This is probably not going to be freezing rain, just kind of a rain and snow mix at times. A better chance of that south of the Aleutians. And you can see our next weather maker trying to spin up here across the Gulf of Anadyr. A lot of that, again, bringing in that colder air across the Bering Sea. Meanwhile, high pressure setting up just on the other side of the trough across the eastern Gulf. That will lessen the winds a little bit, and this is pretty cold stuff here, so southeast will remain under that big chill factor. As we get into Saturday, the ridge of high pressure kind of pushing its way out toward Prince William Sound. Some pockets of snow showers maybe around the Alaska Range, but things should start to break up as far as the cloud cover goes in south central, so the threat for freezing precipitation or snow or any precipitation for that matter should really start to fall apart. Kodiak, you might be looking at some light rain from time to time, mixed precipitation, rain or snow across the YK Delta and Norton Sound, and snow across the Brooks Range and the Arctic coast into the Beaufort Sea coast and parts of the eastern interior. Some of this again could be some accumulating snow, probably several inches, especially for the Arctic coast there, ahead of that wave moving eastward. Out to the west, you can see another surge of colder air developing there, a 992 millibar low. Not really anything to write home about just yet. But certainly an organizing storm here as this is kind of spinning up and perhaps sending another surge toward the west coast as we get into Sunday and Monday. But for right now, this frontal boundary locked in place thanks to the upper level pattern, the jet stream, for instance, pretty much locked in place as well. Those are what provide the steering currents for the weather that we experience down here below. The upper level winds make all the difference. As we look at southeast, here are temperatures that are a little bit warmer than what we were talking about this time yesterday. 20s and 30s for parts of southeast today. Juneau about 34, Haines and Skagway in the low to mid 20s. Looked like Gustavus was around 16 today. Petersburg around 23. You can see many areas in the southern parts of the Panhandle in the low to mid 30s at least. So chilly stuff there, maybe not as bad as it was yesterday. Up around Dawson though in the Yukon, 29 below. So right under that ridge of high pressures where the really deep, hardcore cold is right now. A lot of that has shifted out of the interior thanks to that warming pattern trying to bring in that southerly flow to where you are. Teens and probably upper 20s there as you get into the higher terrain around the Fairbanks area and North Pole. Look like Greeley was 16, 34 in Healy, and you can see South Central's also warmed up considerably over yesterday. Not warm enough to keep it from being an ice rink on the roads, but 20s and 30s there. Kenai only 29. We understand that a lot of the roads there all the way along the Seward Highway and the Glen Highway are just a mess. So again, if you don't have to go out and drive tonight, not a great idea. We encourage you to visit Alaska 511, the state's road reporting website there. So a really great tool to use if you haven't checked that out there. And we've linked to that on our Facebook page, again on U.S. National Weather Service Alaska. Kodiak 41 this afternoon. And as you go up toward Tanana, a big difference on the other side of the hill, only 7 there. So a big difference thanks to that southerly moving air with the warm and wet conditions. Overrunning that though, you can see the changes here. If any precipitation falls into that around the Fort Yukon at 18 below this afternoon, well, that's where we get that freezing rain threat. 18 below in Arctic Village as well. Single-digit territory for the Arctic coast. Barrow was 13 today around Kotzebue Sound. Temps in the 20s and 30s. This is in the Kotzebue Sound region. This is an impressive weather pattern. 33 in Nome, 36 around Gamble and St. Lawrence Island, 24 in McGrath, 41 in Bethel, Nunivak Island only 36. Warm stuff around Port Hyden today, 50 degrees this afternoon. Many areas along the Alaska Peninsula were closing in on that 50-degree mark, including Sand Point. 43 in Dutch Harbor, Adak and Atka both straddling the 40-degree mark, and 34 in Shemya. Now, overnight temperatures across the eastern interior will be sub-zero once again for many places from Arctic Village all the way to Northway and Eagle, but that's about where it stops. You get into the Tanana Valley and all of a sudden temperatures jump into the mid to upper teens. That's on the plus side of zero out across the west coast, the Chukchi Seacoast, Seward Peninsula, YK Delta. Most areas there along the coast will be at or above freezing. Southeast, not the case. Teens and 20s for you. Juneau around 11, Hyder around 30. Looks like Ketchikan and Annette in the 20s there, Sitka 27, so pretty cold air right here across southeast. South Central, mid to upper 20s, Kodiak 40. Looks like most of the Alaska Peninsula will be in the mid-40s with the Aleutians in the mid-30s there. So cold stuff out across the west and the east, not so much in the middle. It looks like high temperatures tomorrow will moderate upwards once again across the interior, upper 20s and lower 30s. The west coast, some places like Nome in the 40s for mid-December. That's impressive. Bristol Bay, lower 40s there. For southeast, 20s and 30s. Sitka again, 38 degrees. Juneau about 27. Fairbanks closing in on freezing with Anchorage also in the low to mid 30s. So some improvement there. Flying weather now. You can see patchy IFR conditions across the Arctic coast around Kotzebue Sound, the Brooks Range, and just points south there along the slopes, the YK Delta and Norton Sound, and the Alaska Peninsula, especially on the south side where that warm and wet air is running into some of the higher terrain. Also patches of MVFR across the northern parts of the western Bering Sea. Pass conditions, we expect IFR across Anaktuvik and Antigan Pass tomorrow. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass both at MVFR. Rainy Pass, marginal conditions. Same goes for Windy Pass for your Friday. Isabel Pass right now, if you got to go that way, things look pretty good. VFR conditions there, and for Mentasta Pass. For Tanita Pass, probably MVFR. We'll see some improvements around Portage Pass throughout the day. Chilkoot and White Pass also expected to be cold, but VFR. The freezing levels indicate the weather pattern pretty well here. You'll notice a 2,000-foot freezing line way up across the Chukchi Seacoast, as high as 8,000 feet just south of Kodiak Island in the Alaska Peninsula. And here's our surface freezing line in white. See how far north that goes into Kotzebue Sound? That's that cold air, and then the warm and wet air running up and over that. So that is exactly what's going on with our weather pattern. Below that then, especially below 2,000 feet, freezing rain. And again, some extreme icing potential in those cases there, especially close to ground level. Some pilots across South Central today did notice that again. So be extra careful and check the weather conditions before you go if you don't have to go. Tomorrow's probably not your day across the middle Yukon Valley up to the Kotzebue Sound region, and maybe even in South Central. There could still be some light freezing rain potential mixed in with any weather that we see tomorrow. So again, be very careful about that. Here's the jet stream. Remember, we were talking about that upside down U pattern, that omega pattern. If you're thinking about the Greek alphabet, here you go. Upside down U means we have high pressure locked in place here, storms on either side, but not a whole lot of motion either way right now. This pattern is pretty much locked in place. This is sending a lot of cold down to the lower 48 states. This is sending a lot of warmth up the west coast of Alaska, and it's keeping that pattern pretty much set. At 9,000 feet, here's our ridge once again, just offshore of Prince William Sound and south of the Kenai Peninsula, running that warm and wet air up the west coast and bringing that cold air right down into southeast. You can see the next pattern trying to develop across the west, but it's got nowhere to go as far as high pressure sitting right across south central. At 3,000 feet, very similar conditions here. Light winds aloft over southeast, stronger winds south of the Alaska Peninsula between 60 and 70 knots, even some stronger winds running up through Norton Sound in the Seward Peninsula. And here's another ridge trying to work its way into the south side of that low pressure system across eastern Siberia, so really nowhere for this weather pattern to go anywhere fast. Turbulence potential, then we see a greater threat for turbulence across the west again tomorrow, especially across Kotzebue Sound, the western parts of the Brooks Range, all the way down through the lower and mid Yukon Valley, and then as high as 6,000 feet and below for Kodiak Island, the Alaska Peninsula, and Bristol Bay. Eastern areas, Copper River Basin, eastern parts of the interior, the upper Yukon Valley, and southeast, probably okay. If you've got to fly in southeast tomorrow, things look pretty smooth, they look pretty clear, but they certainly look pretty cold out there. So if you're prepping your ride outside, again, it could be one of those thicker glove, mitten, and hat kind of days. Out across the west, a little bit of chop across the Aleutians, not too bad. Visibility may be a little bit more improved out across parts of the Aleutians as well. That's a look at your aviation forecast. Of course, we'll be back with a look at your marine weather here in just a few minutes, right after the Stargazers.
Goodbye, Summer Triangle. Hello, Winter Hexagon.
Welcome to Stargazers. I'm James Albury, director of the Kika Silva Pla Planetarium in Gainesville, Florida.
And I'm Marlene Hidalgo, science teacher from Miami, Florida.
And I'm Dean Regas, astronomer from the Cincinnati Observatory.
This week we have two celestial polygons gracing our evening skies.
Yep, we'll be saying goodbye to the Summer Triangle.
And hello to the Winter Hexagon.
Altogether, that's 9 constellations containing 10 of the brightest stars in the sky. Let's show you.
Our skies are set up for just after sunset this week. If you look west, you'll see 3 bright stars making the asterism we call the Summer Triangle.
Vega is the brightest star of Lyra the Harp, Deneb is the brightest star of Cygnus the Swan, and Altair is the brightest star of Aquila the Eagle.
The brightest star in the triangle is Vega, and it's only 25 light years from Earth, and Vega is one of the most luminous stars in our neighborhood. Vega was our North Star way back in 12,000 BC, and it will be again in 14,000 AD, thanks to the top-like wobble our Earth makes over the course of 26,000 years.
The second brightest triangle star, Altair, is only 17 light years from Earth. Of all the stars near us, Altair spins the fastest. Altair makes one complete rotation in only 9 hours. Compare that to our Sun, which takes 26 days to complete one rotation. This rapid spinning has caused Altair to flatten out like an M&M.
Yum, I like M&Ms. The last star of the Summer Triangle is the blue-white star Deneb. Deneb is almost 60,000 times as bright as our Sun. However, because it's over 1,500 light years away from us, it appears much fainter than Vega and Altair, and is almost 110 times as wide as our Sun.
If you go outside just before 10 p.m. and look toward the east, you'll see a star pattern called the Winter Hexagon. Covering almost half the sky, this asterism incorporates 6 constellations and 8 of the 20 brightest stars visible from Earth. The Winter Hexagon definitely puts its stamp on the season.
The most recognizable constellation in the Winter Hexagon is Orion the Hunter. Bright blue Rigel marks one of the stars in the Winter Hexagon, and it also marks Orion's left foot. If you take Orion's belt of 3 stars and look to the west, this will lead you to the next star in the hexagon, Aldebaran.
Aldebaran marks the eye of Taurus the Bull. This star is a red giant almost 68 light years away from us. Taurus has a small V shape of 5 stars for a face and 2 long horns. One of those horns connects to the constellation containing our next star in the hexagon, the yellow star Capella.
Capella is 42 light years away from us and is the brightest star in the pentagon-shaped constellation Auriga the Charioteer. Greek myths describe Auriga as having difficulty walking, which led him to invent the chariot. Although it appears to be a single star to the naked eye, Capella is actually a star system of 4 stars in 2 binary pairs.
The last 4 stars of the winter hexagon come from 3 different constellations. Just to the east of Capella are the stars Castor and Pollux. These stars make up the head of the Gemini twins. Castor is almost 50 light years away and is actually a group of 6 stars. Pollux is 34 light years away and is actually 2 stars orbiting each other. The bright planet Jupiter is among the stars of Gemini and will make the twins easy to find.
Just below and to the south of the Gemini twins are the 2 stars that mark Orion's smaller dog, Canis Minor. The brighter star is Procyon and the dimmer star is Gomesa. Procyon is the 8th brightest star in the night sky, but that can't compare to the last star in the winter hexagon, Sirius.
Sirius marks the eye of Orion's larger dog, Canis Major. Sirius, aptly named the dog star, is only 8 light years away, making it the brightest star in the night sky.
So there you have it. In the west, right after sunset, Vega, Altair, and Deneb, the stars of the summer triangle.
And a few hours later, the winter hexagon shines brightly in the east, featuring Rigel, Aldebaran, Capella, Castor, Pollux, Procyon, and Sirius.
And it's all there for you this week if you keep looking up.
Well, if you look at across the west coast with the upper level weather pattern and that stationary boundary parked across the west, we're certainly seeing the opportunity for ice to continue across coastal areas, even shore-fast ice at that. But it should be no surprise that areas along the Chukchi Sea are not filling in terribly quickly at this point. The Bering Strait is getting closer and closer to being closed off, but we're not there yet. This is Wednesday's analysis, today's analysis, and you can always check yesterday's analysis. You can always check the very latest at weather.gov/Anchorage/ice from the Alaska Sea Ice Program there. Of course, the Beaufort Seacoast filled in there, and parts of the Cook Inlet also starting to accumulate more and more ice. Looking at southeast now, as I mentioned, a lot of the areas will be seeing diminishing winds as we get into Saturday. Northerlies continue, though, thanks to that cold, draining wind out of the Yukon. 15 to 20 knots or so will bring 3 to 4 foot seas across some of the northern areas, and light winds on the coastal sections, anywhere from the west and southwest around 10 knots to more of a north and easterly flow flowing out of the southern coastal areas and the Dixon entrance. 6 foot seas expected there. You'll notice as we get into Saturday, winds anywhere from 10 to 15 knots in all regions, only 2 foot seas on the inside, and anywhere from 6 to 7 foot seas along coastal areas with more of a north and westerly wind running down the entire length of the coast. For south central, variable winds inside Prince William Sound and outside as well, more of an onshore flow coming into Homer, Resurrection Bay, and into the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay area. That's more of an easterly wind up to 30 knots. 8 foot seas expected there on either side of Kodiak Island, 5 to 9 foot seas with 25 knot winds coming in from the north and east, and southeasterly winds coming into Kodiak from the south and east at 25 knots. Look for more of a variable flow in the northern parts of Cook Inlet. And again, seas are going to be small as long as you're able to see the sea. Again, with a little bit of ice forming in the region, expect those seas to become very small and probably negligible as we get into the next couple of weeks. Look for a variable flow inside Prince William Sound, outside of the Sound, across areas south and east of the Kenai Peninsula. All those winds around 10 knots or so, and some of them variable throughout the day. 6 to 8 foot seas as you head out into the Gulf. 10 to 12 foot seas south of the Kenai Peninsula and into Kodiak Island. Around Shelikof Strait, that's a 5 foot sea with an easterly wind. Northeasterly strengthen a little bit as you get down toward the Barren Islands, from 10 knots to more of an easterly flow at 25 knots on Saturday. Across the Alaska Peninsula, a broad southeasterly flow between 35 and 40 knots. 8 to 9 foot seas on the Bering Sea side. 13 to 17 foot seas on the Pacific side. Those become broad and easterly from about 30 to 35 knots on Saturday, with seas around 17 feet around the Pacific and 4 to 9 feet in the Bering. Across the Aleutians now, you'll notice a west and southwesterly flow across the western islands, more of a stronger north and westerly flow from the central and eastern islands. And there's our storm force winds as we get into Friday afternoon, those up to 50 knots with a 19 foot sea, 45 knot winds coming into Unalaska and Nikolsky from the north, and also across some of the southern areas there into the Pacific. A little bit of a shift and winds diminish as we get into Saturday, so a little bit of improvement there. Northeasterlies only at 25 knots, north of Unalaska at 14 feet. Northerlies north of Atka and Adak at 35 knots, and southerlies they're already building in across the western Aleutians with 12-foot seas expected to start the weekend. For the west coast now, a southerly flow from the St. Matthew Island waters into St. Lawrence Island, 6 to 10-foot seas there. A northerly wind north of Nunivak, and then southeasterlies coming into the south side of that out of the Kuskokwim Bay with 11-foot seas there. Northerlies around the Pribilofs also at 35 knots. By Saturday, a little bit of a change. Still looking at winds around 20 knots across St. Matthew, southwesterlies over St. Lawrence Island, and easterly wind coming across Nunivak Island there with southeasterlies still working up from Bristol Bay at 35 knots with a 10-foot sea. Across the north slope now, you're looking at 5 to 6-foot seas from Cape Lisburne all the way down into Kotzebue Sound. 25-knot winds there. Ice will continue to allow the winds to move a little bit faster across the Beaufort Seacoast. 15 to 20 knots in the east, 25 knots mainly west of Barrow down toward Point Lay. And for Saturday, look for winds to pick up a little bit more, 30 to 35 knot winds over the ice again, and then more of a southwesterly shift taking place from Wainwright to Point Lay all the way down towards Shishmaref, again with a 4 to 5-foot sea there across the southern parts of the Chukchi Seacoast. That's your marine forecast. Let's recap what's going on around the state tonight. High pressure sitting across the Yukon is keeping intense cold locked up across mostly western Canada. Some of that is sneaking into the upper Yukon valleys and the Copper River Basin. It's also working to keep southeast pretty cold and pretty clear, but the rest of the focus is on the west coast, south central, and the interior for winter storm watches, warnings, and advisories. Make sure you head to weather.gov tonight and click on Alaska or turn on your weather radio for the very latest updates in your area. Looks like freezing rain advisories will continue until midnight for many parts of south central. For the interior, winter storm warnings continue at least until 9 o'clock for some of the western areas, including places around Galena, I believe, and the middle and even upper Yukon Valley. For Fairbanks tonight, freezing rain advisory in effect for you. Looking for about 1/10 of an inch of ice, I believe, around your region. You'll want to be prepared for slick road conditions there on top of warmer than usual temperatures for sure. Rain across the west coast and rain and snow to the west of that stationary boundary. Very little change as we get into Friday as far as the entire weather pattern goes. Things will be drying up for south central, accumulating snow possible for the Arctic coast and parts of the interior with rain moving over the Seward Peninsula. Still dry through Friday in the southeast, but more rain as we head into Saturday. Enjoy your evening.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.